Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy for Zimperium. And I'd like to welcome you to another of our webinar series. This is one that we've had a lot of customers been asking us about in terms of what exactly do hackers want with our employees' mobile devices. So before we dive in, usual perfunctory commentary. Please use the Q&A section to send any questions to me. And I'll field those questions at the end. We try to keep these webinars to maybe 20 minutes worth of content and then whatever questions. And if there aren't any questions, then we let people go. If there is, then we're happy to either field them live or via email afterwards if that's more appropriate. And then the webinar will be up on the site within a day or so, a recorded archived version. And we can also make slides available to people if you're interested. Please don't use the chat capability. We've been having a little difficulty with it. It doesn't work as well as we'd like. So even if you have technical difficulties, please just drop it in the Q&A section. So with that, we're going to dive in and talk about what the top 5 reasons that hackers actually want your employees' mobile devices. One of the ones that's not on here, which is going to be kind of a little bonus for you, but it's critical as we kind of start off and talk about how mobile is different than traditional endpoints. One of the main ways that mobile is different than traditional is that the user is the admin, and that the user, there's something about the fact that it's this little device that's in your pocket, or this little device that's in your purse, or whatever the case may be, makes it personal. So one of the main things is, unless it's a really locked down, supervised mode mobile device, there's usually a combination of personal and professional. So one of the things that hackers definitely want on your employees' mobile devices has nothing to do with your company. It has to do with the personal stuff. There's all sorts of different things that they might want to capture on the personal side that as an employee, you have to worry about as an individual. But I'm focused specifically on the top 5 things that they want from your employee devices that have to do with the enterprise. So we always like to make sure that everybody sees the infamous forest for the trees. And I think it's really important as we start this whole process to level set with this simple fact. Zimperium has thousands of customers around the world, tens of millions of endpoints. 100% of our enterprise customers are detecting threats on an ongoing basis. 100%. So a lot of folks are like, well, we're not quite sure, how real is the threat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's usually because those are people that don't have any visibility, any monitoring, any protection on their devices. Those people that have protection on their devices, like our enterprise customers, realize that they're getting hit. And it's not surprising. Well over half the devices accessing enterprise networks today are now mobile, whether it's tablets or smartphones. So they're out there, the user's the admin, they don't have a lot of protection on them. The bad guys, as we talk a lot about, they are bad people, but they're very good at what they do. And one of the time-tested security adages is land and expand. Because they're smart at what they do, it's not about ego. They're not going to try just to go to the hardest possible way to get into a network just to prove they can. They're in business. So what they do is they find the weakest link and they make their way in. And those weakest links, I've been in security for 20 years, those weakest links have constantly changed and shifted, right? A few years ago, it was point of sale terminals. Now it's mobile. Because they're outside of the corporate network, the user's the admin, they connect to random Wi-Fi's, they do all this kind of stuff. So what are the top 5 things that the hackers are actually going to want? And as we dive into it, the first thing we have to recognize is, and all the leading companies recognize this fact, an endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. Whatever data or access you have on a laptop or a desktop, if you have the same thing on a tablet, you have to look at it the exact same way, and the hackers look at it the exact same way. So what are some of those things? Number 1, what is the first thing that they're after? seems pretty simple and straightforward, right? It's credentials. They will go after mobile devices because quite often, as I mentioned, on the combination of personal and professional, we use the same passwords. And since, again, there's no protection on a lot of these devices, I can very quickly, whether it's through compromising a device, and I'm going to get to the attacks a little bit later, because I'm focused first on why do they care, then I'll get to how do they do it, right? So they care because they want credentials. And they want credentials quite often because we're human, and even with there's some emerging things that are around biometrics and other password things, and tokens, et cetera. But the simple fact is that a lot of humans are still human, and they still use the same passwords, whether it's for their Gmail account, whether it's for PayPal, whether it's for eBay, or whether it's for their corporate email, for their corporate access and the like. So stealing credentials and passwords is the first thing that the hackers want when it comes to mobile devices. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, makes a lot of sense. But again, because the users outside the network and all these different places, they're significantly more exposed than they are when they're inside networks and or being forced to go down a certain path. Verizon estimates that 90% of breaches last year started with a phishing attack, and almost 2/3 of emails are read on mobile devices. So one of the fastest ways for the hackers to get credentials is mobile phishing. Mobile phishing is a real issue. It's a real problem. And again, because you're on this device that's outside the network and you're using it for both personal and professional, it could be that you get phished on the Gmail side or the Hotmail side or whatever personal email you happen to be using. And that is able to then compromise the device, which then enables them to go off, whether it's stealing the credentials directly or delivering an exploit, which I'll get to a little bit later. But credentials and passwords, obviously job number one. If you get those, you can start leveraging them. And we've even noticed it even as I go further into some of these things. The common theme, if you ask any security professional, what is the biggest risk? And this has been, like I said, for as long as I've been in security. If you say, what is the biggest risk to an organization? The answer is and has always been a carbon-based life form, a human being. Human beings make really, really dicey decisions. And it's not just the users. It's also the admins. Many, many times you have servers and stuff that have, canned passwords or, things on those lines. So getting passwords and credentials is absolutely key. So what's number two? What's the second thing that hackers are after? Data. I know it sounds, again, some of these are BFOs, blinding flashes of the obvious, but mobile devices now quite often have almost as much data on them as traditional endpoints. So when I look at it, I say what is the data that's on a device, and then what is the data that device can access? And sometimes, they're different, obviously. So on the first one, a traditional desktop, laptop, whatever the case may be, you might have more files on there because you're actually creating there. You're creating the new spreadsheet. You're creating the new docs that are floating around the company. Things on those lines. Then whereas on the mobile device, you may or may not have it. Depends on if you're using it to present or whatever the case may be. At least you think it might not be on there. But the number one thing that we see, even as companies are just dipping their toe into the mobile productivity enhancement world, the first thing that every one of their employees wants is access to their email, right? I just mentioned that 2/3 of the emails are being read on mobile now. So they want access to email. What a lot of people don't realize is the emails clients on mobile devices, every attachment that email processes is in a folder on that mobile device. So the simple fact is, if you are accessing your email on your phone, all of the attachments and all of the data that's on that phone that's in those emails is now on your phone. So there's a lot of people that say, well, we don't actually allow people to put documents on their, if you're allowing email, there is data on that phone, and there is data that that phone is accessing, like in the case of email, that is freely available to a hacker. And they can use it all sorts of different ways, including some of the things I'm about to talk about as we go further down this chain. So the first thing they want is your users and your credentials and your passwords, because that can get them all sorts of different directions if they can find ways to reuse them. Second part is the data itself, the data that's on the device and or the data that the device is accessing, because it all ultimately ends up on the device, as I was mentioning. When we do one of our attack demonstrations, we literally show, here's the folder of all the attachments that's in the email, and it of course has tremendous value. So, and by the way, this is like a cross-industry example, right? When we actually get into specific industries, there's other data that's critical that's on there, right? If you're in healthcare, patient information, right? If you're, we've got utility customers that have started a digital transformation exercise to move away from paper to giving their service technicians and the like iPads with all the schematics of pipelines, grids, et cetera. Well, that's just straight up data that's incredibly valuable to any potential hacker. It could be client data if you're a legal firm or a consulting firm. The list goes on. So obviously, if your data has value to anybody, cardholder data, patient data, whatever, that is one of the main things, of course, they're after. So passwords and credentials first, kind of makes sense, low-hanging fruit. Next thing, any data that's actually on that device or being accessed by that device is obviously critical. That's the crown jewels, right? So what's the third major thing that hackers want on mobile devices, on your employees' mobile devices? Reconnaissance. Simple reconnaissance. Simple and very effective reconnaissance. So what sort of reconnaissance? Well, first thing is, let's turn the microphone on. Imagine if a CFO of a Fortune 500 company had their phone with them and they were discussing the earnings announcements before they went public. Pretty interesting information, right? A couple of years ago, Russia was caught by bolting a fake Wi-Fi network onto a drone and flying it around a NATO base in Poland. 4,000 soldiers' phones connected to it, and 4,000 soldiers' phones, cameras, and microphones were turned on. So they were able to hear everything that was going on there. And since I mentioned it, camera. Everyone's got the camera. I can take pictures. And by the way, camera not only of what the camera itself is pointing towards, but screen capture. So everything that's on that phone, when a hacker takes over the phone, they don't have as much control as a typical user. They have 10 times more control because they actually have access down at the root level of the device, and they can do everything, including taking screen caps or turning the microphone on. And then there's a whole nother set of reconnaissance that comes in all around executives, for instance. Where is this executive? What is his calendar? Well, download all his contacts. These things all come in, especially when we start talking about contacts. They come in very handy in some of the next things that the hackers want. So the first thing they want is the passwords. Second thing they want is the data. Third thing is they want reconnaissance. Part of the reconnaissance also that they want when they actually are looking at your device is the device itself, so that they know what exploits to deliver on it. And then eventually, what are the other devices that are connected to this as well, right? So that they can pivot and do some further damage, which I'm about to talk about. But fundamentally, the reconnaissance part, the first two, maybe all three of these buckets, are kind of variations of data again, but there are different types of data and can be very, very, very powerful and or damaging, depending on what it happens to be. Again, I mentioned the CFO example. It could be everything as business deals. It could be intellectual property. It could be any of these things are things that have tremendous value. And because these little things are in our pockets all the time, it could be in situations you would not ordinarily think of. The recent FaceTime hack, and by the way, is kind of another example. So make sure you update your iOS phones. There was also 2 exploits that didn't get as much run on that latest patch that enabled complete device compromise, which were actually more dangerous than the FaceTime one. But the FaceTime one fits in the Reconnaissance thing, so toss that out here. What's number 4? What's number 4? We've got the passwords, we've got the data, we're reconnaissing. What's number 4? Gaining access to the corporation. So we mentioned that the user's the admin. Users are also the ones that usually create the biggest security problems. We were terrified of users, carbon-based life forms, making bad decisions when they were inside the corporate network 100% of the time, where we spent billions of dollars on network security. They were on centrally managed desktops and laptops that had antivirus and centrally managed patch management system to keep them up to date and all those kind of fun stuff, right? Well, now that person is the admin of this supercomputer in their pocket that spends about 80% of its time outside of all of those investments in corporate networks and security and everything that we were talking about. So now they're out there, they're deciding what to do and what sort of stuff to have. But that device is now easy to be exposed because land and expand, right? Bad guys go after it, no security, users in charge. They decide what apps to put on, what networks to connect to, right? So they're out there. So they compromise the device, like we were just talking about. Part of it's for the data and the reconnaissance and everything that's on there. But then there's a few major ways. I'm just going to give a couple examples. The idea is not just to stay on the phone. The idea is to pivot and use what we've learned, we meaning the hacker, use what the hacker has learned to get into the network, to come through all that network security, literally walk directly in. Remember the old days when somebody would drop a USB drive in the lobby or something, and somebody would pick it up and go, "Hey, I wonder what this is," and pop it into his computer, and poof, they're gone. That's the way they got by network security. Well, everyone walks in and out with their smartphones all the time, right? So what are a few ways to gain corporate access? Because ultimately, there's what's on the device, but then there's a whole bunch of stuff behind the firewalls, right? Well, the first one is spear phishing. Spear phishing will come up a couple times here. In this context, there's phishing, which we talked about earlier, which is an untargeted spread a net and see how many people actually go give me their credentials or hit a website so I can use that to exploit your phone. Then there's spear phishing, which is, we just mentioned, one of the reconnaissance things was, give me all my contacts, right? And I mentioned this, the fictitious CFO. Let's just continue to use him for fun, right? Now I have his contacts. I have access to his email. I have access to his phone. I can now either send texts or I can send emails to anybody in my contacts, and it literally is coming from me. It is coming from my device. So it is highly targeted. So for instance, let's say that the CFO's phone is the one we compromised. Maybe we use that to actually ping one of his underlings and said, hey, email me the latest earnings announcement. I need to give it a once over. Gets emailed, hacker now has it, right? So now a different example is, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, you could actually, instead of saying, hey, spear phishing, give me something back out, we could send an email using the fact that we're now part of this email system that includes an attachment that can actually then spread malware, which I'm going to talk about in the next one. So, and then that malware can gain access and do different things, right? Another thing, we did a whole webinar on this with a super smart tie-in penetration tester / white hat in the 4th quarter. You can go back and check that webinar out. It's called Golden Ticket. And what they were basically tasked with was a very simple thing. They were hired by the company because the company was doing its own, penetration testing. And the company said, we want you to exfiltrate some data. The only thing is we want you to start with an employee. That was the whole thing. So they started with a phishing attack, straight up phishing, normal, outside, nothing to do with mobile. Totally failed. And it totally failed because they had had phishing training like 2 days before. So it was a little bit of a setup. I won't give away the whole story because you can go back and check out the webinar. But what they noticed was when they were in the lobby getting ready for this project, that there was a guest network and there was way more devices connected to the guest network in the lobby than there were people in the lobby. So they very quickly figured out that there were employees that were using that network because maybe it was less restrictive than the corporate network to be able to get out to different things, et cetera, et cetera. They socially engineered an attack against the Android device of the receptionist by tricking her into downloading a game. When she did, they were able to use that and ultimately pivot all the way through the intranet to eventually getting the golden ticket, which is basically 10 years worth of, you don't even need a password, admin privileges for all of the Active Directory accounts or servers within that company. So it went from a Android device all the way to being a super admin inside the company. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in this, go back and check out that webinar. Like I said, it was in the fourth quarter. So I've got passwords, I've gotten data, I've done reconnaissance in terms of microphones and cameras and contacts. I've used that to be able to gain corporate access. And one of the other things that happens a lot is, and it's somewhat between this one and the next one, is, well, actually, no, I'll talk about it in the next one. I'll just make it, I'll have you guys sit here in breathless anticipation to see what I'm going to do. Okay, passwords, data, credentials, and surveillance, and then ultimately accessing a corporate network and being able to do some stuff. So once I've accessed that corporate network, what are some of the things that we want to do, right? Delivering malware is a primary thing. So we've been able to bypass, and we're using malware as a catchphrase for any kind of exploit that can actually compromise and then enable us to continue expanding within the enterprise itself. So one example, of course, is ransomware. Whether it was from spear phishing, as we talked about, I'd send you an email, and that email has WannaCry capabilities in it directly. Or if it's via a couple other different approaches. And one of the approaches, if you're not familiar, the Lazarus Group is North Korea backed. They're credited with attacking Sony after the interview came out, the movie. They also are believed to be one of the primary people behind WannaCry, the ransomware that has been floating around Windows PCs and all of that over the last few years. This is an eWeek article, but our researchers back it up. The Lazarus Group is absolutely doing Android malware. Matter of fact, we detected something that has all of the calling cards of them. And the first thing that malware did was, on the Android device, scan all of the Windows PCs, all the Windows devices on the same Wi-Fi network that Android device was now on, to see which one of them are susceptible to WannaCry. So the hackers, they've got all these different things. There's money and passwords. And I'm using money. If you're a nation state, obviously there's something other than money that might be driving things. But for the majority of us, there's money in passwords and credentials. There's money in data. There's money in all of the elements of surveillance, including recordings and in intellectual property that can be brought up. There's money inside the moat. And if I can get on this simple little device that has no protection and it walks right through the front door, it sends an email right to the front door, and then I can expand from there. And then there's money in things like ransomware. So in terms of why do the hackers care, that's across the board. So just briefly, because this is not supposed to be a product conversation, but how do they actually do these attacks? And then how does Zimperium fit in? There's 4 primary attacks. There's malicious apps, phishing, networks, and compromised devices. The ultimate objective is to compromise the device. I mentioned land and expand is a time-tested tradition within the hackers. Another one is persistence. Any different device that they take over, they want to remain persistent so that they can continue to pivot and move, just like I just got finished describing. The only way to do that in mobile, since all apps are in containers, they're in their own buckets, is to actually compromise the device. So malicious apps and phishing are potentially a delivery mechanism to do that, but mostly malicious apps are fraud. They're untargeted fraud, completely untargeted. Phishing sites are untargeted. They can get credentials, which could be leveraged, and they can deliver an exploit, which could be leveraged, but again, it's untargeted. The bad guys are good at what they do, as I've said. If they're targeting XYZ bank, they're not going to drop an app in the App Store and hope that somebody downloads it. They're not going to go phishing broadly through all of Gmail or Hotmail or Yahoo and hope that they happen to get somebody from XYZ bank. What they're going to do is they're going to set up a fake Wi-Fi network directly across from one of the offices of XYZ. 90% of the targeted attacks begin with a network attack. Targeted attack meaning I'm going after XYZ. Once they find somebody from XYZ, then they deliver an exploit so that they can accomplish all the 5 things we just got finished talking about. So what that does is that says you have to do your device, you have to do all of your detection on device because the bad guy owns the network. So if all of your detection is up in the cloud, the first thing the bad guy does is completely cut off all that communication. So we have one core engine, it's called Z9. It does machine learning detection on device of device network phishing and malicious app attacks. So it does that on device. That engine can be rolled out in one of 2 ways. If you're trying to protect your devices 100% of the time against all of these attacks, basically next generation endpoint protection for mobile, that's a product called Zips. It runs 100% of the time. It's like having antivirus, whatever you want to think. It runs 100% of the time on your device and protects you against all those attacks. If you have a mobile app that you're using and you want to protect that app and the session that app is having against the same attacks, we have a software development kit, an SDK called ZApp for in-app protection, and it literally drops Z9 directly into a mobile app. So we have customers that are across the board, but one that's easy to illustrate is we have a great banking customer that is using Zips to protect all its employees, and it's using ZApp to protect millions of mobile banking customers. So it's different use cases. Both of those come into our console. One of the huge advantages of doing 100% of our detection on device is we are completely cloud agnostic. The folks that have cloud-based detection have had to pick one of the providers. We don't care what cloud you put it on. We don't care if you want to do on-prem versus not. Behind that console is a capability called Z3A. That stands for Advanced App Analysis. It is a mobile app reputation capability. On your employees' devices, there's malicious apps, which are automatically detected by Z9, but then there's perfectly legitimate apps. But since apps are put together like Legos with different little libraries and SDKs from all sorts of different places, quite often there are security and privacy risks in the legitimate apps that are on your employees' devices. So you need to find out, for instance, is it sending traffic to a foreign country? Is it decrypting traffic? What are these apps doing? And you can set policies for whether or not they can stay in your environment. Behind the console, we integrate with the largest number of EMM providers. We're also the only ones who can do multiple EMMs in a single console. So if you're moving from one to another, or if you inherited both, we can take care of it. And then great forensics and logs that we can integrate in with all the various different SIM products that are out there as well. So why do they want your devices? Credentials, data, reconnaissance, corporate access, and deliver malware or some other exploit to be able to continue to move sideways. So I will leave this up and see what questions you all may have. I thank you again for spending the time with us. So I'm going to wait and see if we have any questions. Okay, I don't see any other questions, which is great. By the way, for those folks, like I mentioned, If you're interested in the how do we pivot to go in, please check out that golden ticket webinar archive that's on our website. There's also a great white paper that comes with it that the pen tester had written. And then the other thing is if you're fascinated by ransomware, we're doing a complete ransomware webinar on the 20th, I believe. That's a deep dive on mobile ransomware and a demonstration of how we actually pivot to, how the bad guys pivot to deliver ransomware in traditional endpoints from a mobile device. So it takes what I was just talking about and dives in a little bit further. So with that, I would like to thank everybody, and I hope you have a great day.